Often he's got a really nice straw hat too, and
I think I've only seen it a few times.
he's always talked about this one because this one I got in Oaxaca when he was there with us on the coffee harvest trip, and for some reason he doesn't bring his out that often.
Nice.
But
And we're recording, just so you're aware. We're talking about John Sheffy's awesome straw hat, and it's a legit straw hat. Like I'm looking at it right now, adjusting a camera, and just it looks quality. It looks well made.
I got it in the Benito Juarez market in Oaxaca City in Mexico on one of our coffee harvest trips, and the guy kind of talked me into it. There's this section of the market that sells only hats. You'll go down these aisles, and some aisles will be selling like dried chilies and herbs and flowers and fruit, and then there's one section that has just like leather and hats. And so I was looking for a hat because the year before I had bought what I thought was a cooler, like it was a lightweight straw hat, and it was just straw. This hat has like this little band inside of it.
Ooh, I would want that.
And I didn't really want that. I kind of liked just like the feeling of the raw straw rubbing on my head.
You're savage.
But the guy talked me into this one because he said, look at the weave here. Look at how tight this is and the stitching in it. This hat will last a really long time. And it's true. This hat's lasted like, I think it's going on 4 years.
Uh-huh.
So,
Nice.
yeah.
Well, before we dive into intros and everything, do straw hats? So I wear a lot of baseball caps, soak up the sweat, and then they just like fall apart after a while. Do straw hats? Do they hold up to sweat fairly well?
I don't know. The interesting thing is I don't sweat.
Oh God, you're one of those. You're one of those people.
No, it does absorb. That's part of the reason why I don't really like this band.
Uh-huh.
But they dry really quickly, and
Uh-huh.
they hold up a lot more than I think like a cotton hat does. So yeah, I mean I wear this all the time when I'm out in the field. It keeps you really cool just having that shaded environment. You can stand out in the sun and
For sure.
don't feel it. And I sweat a ton in it, and it hasn't
It looks like
broken down.
It's held up well.
Yeah.
I like it. All right, well let's get down to the nitty gritty. John, Liberation Farms, Team Early as Fuck podcast. How are you, sir?
Doing great.
Excellent.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, it's a long time coming. We've got our seasonal AF cooking workshop next week. I'm excited for. This will release after that, but if people are listening, there's still August, September, October, November. Liberation will be doing chickens for this one. We've got goat for November. And is there one more in there?
We got rabbit and pork.
Rabbit and pork. That's
yeah.
Right. There's nuts. What is that? October? September? October?
I think the next one we're doing rabbit in August. And
it is August.
September we're doing pork. Yeah,
Okay, yeah.
I think.
Because there was pork jowl on there.
Yeah.
And I got really excited to see that. I'm excited for all these.
We used pork jowl at our first Taco Tuesday, which we had at our market cafe that's recently opened. They were a huge hit. So we were trying to do like a Oaxacan style, like street style taco, where they have these street carts, and they'll, at the beginning of the night, they roll their street carts out, and they have these big pots that they make pozole in, which is a soup that usually has a pork stock. So they'll boil those pork heads and create the stock. Then they take the heads out, they let them cool, and they just pull all the meat off the heads and chop it up.
Yeah.
And that's what they use for their taco meat. And so with the jowl, these were jowls that were from our pigs that we had smoked at the butcher. So they cut off these big, they're like 2-pound, cheek muscles.
Yep.
They smoked them, and then I chopped them up into little pieces and slow cooked them.
Yep.
And that's what we used. It was kind of our version of the smoked pork jowl taco.
God, that sounds fantastic.
I thought, I wasn't sure because we also did chorizo, and they're both so good. But the smoked pork one was more popular than the chorizo.
Did a lot of people know what jowl was going into it? Did they not ask? What was, because I feel
I just called it smoked pork. I didn't get into exactly where it came from.
Because people were in a weird, and I'm specifically talking about the health and fitness world, where we're in a weird time where people are we've in cultural tastes in food and meat and texture definitely change, and that's a part of it. But we're in a weird period where people want boneless, skinless everything. And when you tell them the idea of eating tongue or organ or jowl, something off the bone, a lot of people get squeamish, even though that's like, no, that's where your food's supposed, like meat is supposed to come primarily. It's off a bone at some point.
You got to have the bone.
That's
you
where
got to
the
have
flavor,
the cartilage.
Exactly.
You got to have that skin. I mean, all of those things. It's like whole grain. That's how I would explain it to them. When I was in the Peace Corps in Togo, the way that they cooked meat there was they didn't skin anything. They just burned the hair off.
Yeah.
And then washed it or scraped it off with a machete.
Yep.
And then when they chopped up the meat, you had to have, it was like taking a hole punch and hole punching the carcass, because to have it be a legitimate cut of meat, it had to have some skin, which included a little bit of singed hair, the skin, the fat, the muscle, and the bone, all in one piece.
Yeah.
Like that was the ideal, and they usually cut it up into little chunks. So if you can imagine like a whole animal, goats usually was the most common. If you somehow put it through like one of those things they use to make French fries, and like French fried the whole body, that would be the ideal Togolese way of cutting up an animal, because you'd have a little bit of everything. Because typically in places like Togo, they eat communally. Mm-hmm. So they'll have a big bowl with some kind of starch that you eat with your hands, and a big bowl of spicy, oily soup with a little bit of meat in it. Mm-hmm. And so you might only get one piece of meat in the meal. So it better have a little bit of everything on it, so you get the full experience of eating. But I think there's definitely, like you're saying, a lot of health benefits to having that bone in the broth, and to the fat and to the cartilage. You got to have something that gels up, like, grandpa's head cheese or Soltz or something. There's a lot of health benefits to those things that people don't appreciate. I'm right there with you.
There's so that's what I love about getting people from the farm shed we were talking a little bit before the podcast in on, because primarily my world, people I talk with, health, fitness, that kind of area, and a lot of them are foodies and interested in quality ingredients. And I always laugh because you'll see so many people pushing like micronutrient powders. It's just like all this dried processed kelp greens from various areas. I'm like, you can get all those same nutrients. Eat your radish greens, eat your salad turnip greens, eat it's like, it's the same thing, but people are, oh no, it's this powdered form because the health and fitness world loves powders and potions for everything.
Sure.
I'm like, just eat the entire vegetable. When you're doing your calorie counts for the day, just eat the entire vegetable. Like, I
would just question too, like, are you really enjoying that? Like, how's that shake? Is that really good? Mm-hmm. Like, compared to like a crunchy, oily salad? My favorite way to do greens is just like a little bacon grease, and just like flash fry them.
Yep.
So they're just wilted.
Yep.
Or my grandma used to make what she called wilted lettuce, but with like greens like that, like beet greens.
That was my breakfast this morning.
Just drizzle some bacon grease over the top of them.
Yep.
Put a lid over it and just let it wilt.
Yep.
A little vinegar on there.
So good.
Man.
Kat from Cattail Organics, after the first workshop, she like blew my mind. I like all of these preconceived ideas for what I how I had to make dressings, or like what I could put in them. Just blew it all out the window. Just like threw it up in the air.
I'm gonna have to look
shotgun,
into that.
Just blasted it away. So I've been just like getting wild and crazy with dressings at my house. What is it Cream Line? Comes in a jar. It's like liquid yogurt. Super creamy.
Yeah.
That I always try to make mayo with like eggs and olive oil, and I suck with a blender. Like I watch people do it. I've watched countless videos on how to do it, and my timing, my pour, something's always off. Or just, have you made mayo on your own?
Yeah.
I'm
we like
terrible
to
at
do
it.
that.
I'm useless. So if I can't get someone to do it for me, I'll get what is it? Mark Sisson's avocado mayo.
Mm.
That's like a decent replacement for me, like taste wise. But there's nothing that beats just like homemade mayo. But I'm useless with an immersion blender. I've tried it so many times and I've failed. I haven't quit, but I've grown tired of wasting eggs and olive oil because like the finished product, when you fail, you can eat it. It just doesn't taste very good. Not like
I always use sunflower oil. I get Century sunflower oil.
Maybe
I don't know if that makes a difference.
Maybe it's more forgiving.
Probably doesn't make a difference. I mean, I use the immersion blender. That's kind of a game changer in cooking. Sometimes it turns out thicker, sometimes runnier.
Yeah,
that's just something I don't worry about.
Yeah,
because I usually am mixing it into salads or putting it on as a topping. But I like to use a lot instead of mustard powder. I spice it up a lot more, like using curry powder instead, or just a lot of turmeric. That and chili powder. That makes really good. And it's funny, my daughter really loves it. My daughter Indigo loves homemade mayo, especially on potatoes. Yeah, she'll like throw a fit if we don't have homemade mayo in the house.
Dad, what the
when we're having potatoes.
I like it. So let's we're gonna backtrack a little bit. So you're a farmer, Liberation Farms. How long has that been in operation?
We moved out to Almond. We lived in Stevens Point, my wife Holly and I, for 6 years. And then when our daughter was born in 2011, we moved out to Almond and decided we needed to buy a little tract of land and start our own farm. Before that, we had a micro-urban farm.
Okay.
We lived over by Pacelli High School in Point.
Yeah.
And we had developed our whole, tenth of an acre around our house and part of our neighbor's property too that he let us use into our little farm, where we had mostly perennials, a lot of raised garden beds, mushroom logs, chickens, but we just decided we wanted more space to do more stuff, do more permaculture on a broader scale. And we were looking for places, and we found this cool little place out in Almond, which is surrounded by huge vegetable farms, but it's nestled right into this little glacial moraine with it was kind of just what we were looking for. It has some acres of mature hardwoods, places where we can cut firewood and harvest mushrooms and berries and tap a few maple trees in the spring.
Sounds like there's squirrels there too.
Squirrels.
Get some squirrels too.
Yeah, a lot of wild turkeys.
Now we're talking.
Deer hunt there now, and then we had about 20 acres of mixed old pasture. The farm was probably most well known for being a dirt bike track, because when you look back on Google Earth at the property over the years, you see all the tracks, and there's still the big eroded out turns and the jumps that they created, these big jumps. And we thought that, lended some good character to the landscape. So we didn't do anything to change it. But having grazed animals there, being really sandy soil, we decided to emphasize trying to build soil and do a lot of perennials there. So we've had a lot of animals there. That's what we primarily market from the farm now is poultry, pork, goat, rabbit. And the reason we went that route, especially in the beginning, was to build our soil. So we needed to bring in a lot of nutrients, create a lot of manure, compost, build our soil.
Because you can rotationally graze the three of those animals?
Yeah.
Because you touched on this earlier, you not explaining it more in depth about this. Why those three animals, and what do you mean rebuilding the soil? I understand because I nerd out about this, but for people listening who are just have no idea what you're talking about, how do those animals on the landscape rebuild soil?
Well, we have a loamy sand soil type, and so it's very sandy, but especially on the surface. But when you get down a little bit deeper, like about 16 inches down, it gets a little bit more loamy. But in the top, it's very prone to drying out.
Yep.
And it doesn't hold organic matter very well. Like you apply compost or manure or any kind of organic material, and the soil seems to just like eat it up and it's gone. And especially if you're tilling the soil.
Yeah.
If you're rototilling or plowing or doing any kind of disturbance to the soil, it'll very quickly become bare soil and not support any growth because it just is so lacking in nutrient holding capacity. So we want to build that up by trying to increase the organic matter in the soil, primarily using things that we can produce on site. So we need to bring nutrients onto the site, and rather than buying compost or buying fertilizer or organic material, we want to produce it on site. So we bring organic feed onto the farm, and we have our animals convert that, primarily our chickens and pigs, convert that into their manure. We also have, the goat and the rabbit manure. We compost those, or in some cases we direct apply it to the pasture and to the gardens, and let it break down. And so that over time builds up the organic material, which increases the amount of water holding capacity, nutrient holding capacity, but it really fires up the microbial community in the soil. And it's the microbes that are responsible for making those nutrients that are in the manure available to the plants that you're trying to grow. So when you're trying to grow your soil, you're really trying to increase the microbial life in your soil. And it's just a fascinating thing, like you're saying, geeking out about it.
I love
like
it.
The fungi, the bacteria, the organic matter. We were recently just in Kenya, and one of the places we worked with is called Biogardening Innovations. It's in the western, really humid tropical part of Kenya near Lake Victoria. They have a year-round growing season there. It rains almost the whole year. And farmers have extremely small pieces of land, like a quarter acre of land is all a farmer has that they're trying to make a living, grow all their own food, and support their family by growing things on. So they're growing these really diverse, multi-storied agroforestry systems because things grow so rampantly there. But in order to do that, they really need to manage their soil well. So this organization, Biogardening Innovations, works on doing these amazing fermented compost, bokashi, soil amendment concoctions that they trial with the farmers to see how they can increase their yields by managing, boosting the microbe populations in the soil. And they are using this the bokashi that they use. We visited a farm there where they had a trial. They had one plot of maize and beans, or maize and ground nuts, peanuts that they call. They intercrop those legumes with the cereals. And they had one that was just growing with no soil amendments, one with straight like farmyard manure, another one with composted manure, and then the fourth one was with this bokashi. And I've never seen this before. In the bokashi plot, there were many corn plants that had 4 ears of corn on each stalk.
Wow.
Like I've seen 2. If you have your soil is doing really good and your spacing is pretty good, 2 is pretty common, but I've never seen 4.
Yeah.
And I thought it was like a freak, like genetic anomaly. But then I started walking around and talking to Ferdinand, our host there, and he's like, no, there's another one. There's another one. There's another one. Like, it's possible. That blew my mind when he was saying, if you really get your soil right, the yield is almost infinite.
Yeah. And when it comes to the bokashi, and when we're talking bacteria, what I find so fascinating about it is where so much science right now and research is being done into the human microbiome, both in your gut, on your skin, kind of what that looks like, how it affects how we digest food, how we sleep, hormones, energy levels. And then I look at that so much with the soil, just from the standpoint that we have our little garden. I try to grow a ton of veggies, and because of Farm Shed, I did the frozen assets one year. It made me realize, like, I should be doing this with all my surplus vegetables. So we expanded our garden and we froze a bunch last year, and it worked out really well. But looking at the bacteria and how the soil is, and just our little plot for the garden, talking to Jason, so the garden guru, talk to him all the time. Kat, I know, is really big on it. Obviously, you're really into it, and I'm trying to, everything you all talk about is way over my head, but I'm so interested in the connection between how healthy our soils are, our food, and then obviously the people that make up our community. So that's why I geek out about it, just from the health and fitness standpoint.
Well, think about it. Think about this. I mean, this might seem kind of bizarre, but the microbes are really what are connecting everything to each other. And sometimes I like to imagine that I'm like, where does the human body end and the microbes start? And what else are those microbes connected to?
Yeah.
Because really, it's like if you're a person standing, barefoot in the soil, you're touching all those microbes. They're on your skin, they're in your body, they're in your gut. They're running the show.
Yep.
They're running you, and it's a way to see how linked you are to the soil.
Yeah.
And then you think about all those plants that are growing, the microbes, the fungi and the bacteria are what are extending the root systems of those, like 2/3 of their nutrient gathering capacity is being done by those microbes rather than the plants themselves feeding them. It's the microbes that are feeding them. It's the microbes that are feeding us. And so really, I mean, we're just vehicles for microbes. I mean, do people really exist, or are we just
microbe vessels?
Yeah, exactly. And you can say the same thing about plants, trees. Like, where does the tree root end? Or, maybe we're not these independent beings that we imagine ourselves as being,
So much so. Slowly realizing that as I approach 30, and now in my 30s, it's all connected. There's a quote I use on a lot of the posts and in the podcast, but it's from the book of 5 Rings, where it's once you see the way broadly, you see it in all things. So it's like once you, and I apply it to fitness, to health, to eating, to the little bit of gardening I do, to hunting, dog training even. It's like once the discipline I show in my, how I approach each of those things is the same, and then it kind of like spirals out into the discipline in the people I hang out with, the discipline in how I kind of steward the land, allowing for pollution, the choices I make in what I'm buying, reusable containers, sustainable containers. And so you're talking about bacteria and microbes and how it's all connected, and where does the microbe start and the person start? It all makes sense to me, and I love the idea. It's a question I love pondering and talking about with people from different disciplines. So you yourself, a farmer, soil discipline or disciple, however you want to call it, and then talking to someone who's super into archery or hunting, like similar concepts, and they blend together.
Yeah.
I find it super fascinating.
Yeah, in permaculture, we would call that pattern understanding, and being able to see those patterns, whether you work in a very rural, small community like Almond, or you're in deep urban center, you can experience and observe those same patterns and understand.
For sure.
It's
what's the, is it Kara from Agora? Kara, the name of her garden she has in town?
Numbers in Nature.
That's
her. Yeah, I think that's what they call the micro farm. That's on Main Street, and then they have the Segura and Sons mushroom
Yeah.
business running out of there too.
Yeah, I can only imagine like because it's such a small location compared to even your farm or a larger tract of land, but talking about the same thing and then doing it in that urban environment where I'm sure, maybe not where she is, but I'm sure very close there's people spraying their yards with all manner of chemicals to kill everything, not realizing like, hey, that's probably not beneficial for myself. I know at the gym, even like before I started, they were talking about spraying the surrounding environment. It's like, well, A, my garden's here. B, we have children and adults fitnessing outside on the ground. My dog runs around in the field. It's like, let's pump the brakes on all that. We don't need the strangely weird, perfectly green tract of land. It's not worth everything else that we're doing to the environment. So I'm sure she sees a lot of weird system-wide connections.
Well, when
with what she's doing.
when we started our little micro farm on Maria Drive, it was overwhelmingly positive. Like people would walk by on the sidewalk all the time while we were working out there and say how great it was, how much they liked it. Just shout out some, cheer us on, and we were nervous at first too, because we were, ripped up all the sod, made all these, funky shaped raised beds, planted these, perennial crops and corn and things like that. We brought in a bunch of composted horse manure to kickstart everything, but it was really positive. People were excited, and it was great to see our neighbors on one side of us. They said, "Oh, well, we've got this huge backyard that is right up against the back end of your property, and all we're doing is mowing. And so if you want to use part of that and extend your garden and graze your chickens back there, go for it." And our other neighbor was in her 90s, and it was like it started this great relationship with us where we would come over and she'd be sitting in her area was mostly forested. And she'd be sitting on her patio, and we would just talk about what we're growing in the garden. And she would tell us stories about, she'd lived in that part of Stevens Point on Maria Drive back when the roads weren't paved, and there were people like delivering milk house to house in like horse and buggy. And it just like brought back all these memories for her.
I'm sure. She's like, that's how everyone used to do it.
No
one was out there mowing their grass. It was like everyone had a small garden. I'm sure, because cheap, easy food.
Yeah. So because we did that, it created these strong community bonds. I mean, even people who weren't benefiting from the produce of the garden benefited in these other ways, in the way that they related to the garden and enjoyed it. So
there's a push right now for you kind of see it in the FDA food systems, where everyone's pushing more and more plant-based everything, plant-based diets, plant-based systems. But it seems to me throughout all of your conversations, animals are a key component to healthy systems, healthy soil. Was that the same when you were traveling and they had the I forget the name of the fermented compost?
Oh, the bokashi.
Yeah. Where it was animal byproducts a big part of that?
Yeah, not a huge part. It doesn't have to be, but they definitely do include some manure in them and compost in them. I just think animals are, when they're raised in an ethical way, in a humane way, responsibly on the landscape, they're just a great way to recycle and get a multiple yields out of, like I was saying, rather than bringing in compost, we can make compost on the site. We can purchase feed for the animals, whether it's hay for the goats or grain for the chickens and the pigs. And so we bring the nutrients on in that level, and then we convert it. And while we're converting it to the end product, the nutrients that we want and the organic matter we want, we're getting these other yields of the animals providing a service on the landscape, either through grazing or through rototilling or scratching up and eating bugs. They're giving us that service. They're also giving us the products of their eggs and their meat and their, fiber and other things. So in permaculture, we talk about trying to get as many functions out of everything that we can. So it's a way of stacking up those functions by including the animals. I think it's a great diet too, an omnivore diet, especially in the winter time. It's a great way to capture a lot of those vitamins, like you were saying, eating the nutrient dense parts of the animals in the wintertime to get those parts of your diet, because you're not eating all the fresh greens and fresh vegetables that you're getting during the summer. But I think it's great to have a seasonal diet. And during this time of the year, I mostly eat eggs and tons of greens.
Same.
Because our chickens are just laying eggs like crazy. And we mostly eat, the greens, the indigenous vegetables, the lamb's quarter, the amaranth, the things that come up as weeds in our garden. We primarily eat those as we're weeding. So we're, getting multiple functions out of those too. So then, in the winter, you can eat a little more meat and a little more stored vegetables and fermented vegetables and things. So I'm not like a huge carnivore that thinks you should eat tons of meat all the time.
Yeah.
But I see its place in the diet and in the ecosystem. And personally, I really like working with animals. I love being in the garden, but I also love interacting with animals. I studied wildlife, so that's kind of my training. I went to school for wildlife and forestry. So I think I've just always had a connection with animals.
Yeah.
And I like seeing them out on the pasture and watching sort of the changes that happen when just how much more productive and diverse our pastures have become after, several years, like 7 years now of grazing animals on them. It's amazing. It's awesome to see, and what that means in as far as increasing the organic content in the soil and the carbon sequestration. Like, that's the big priority. That's what we need to do. Like, we need to feed ourselves. We need to have a healthy community, but we're kind of up against a deadline here to try to sequester some carbon out of the atmosphere so we can hang around for a little bit longer.
Right. It's getting to that point. I also saw something interesting where they were testing trees for methane production, and I forget which rainforest it was in, but I'll link it in the show notes. And a lady was monitoring trees and realizing that they release a considerable amount of methane. I forget the numbers, and once again, I'll have it in the show notes. But I thought that was interesting because love social media, hate social media, however, whatever camp people want to fall in. I love it for the idea that we can further the conversation when done responsibly. And we're definitely in that period of technology and social media where it's just too much for a lot of people. So, they start a conversation with, hey, fuck you, I don't believe what you're saying. Like, well, that's probably not a good way to start the conversation. Like, I get that a lot with what I post. I'm posting all the time about a variety of topics, and people who are very passionate about one of the things I'm posting about will make a comment, and right away it's like, well, people that do it that way are foolish or stupid, blah, 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 blah. And it'd be very easy for me to comment underneath like, well, I think you're dumb. The second grade, like, oh, he said I'm dumb, so I'm going to tell that person they're dumb. And I'll always comment, hey, so-and-so, thanks for posting. Appreciate your input, but maybe that's not the best way to go about the conversation. I'll be like, probably shouldn't. Saying that isn't going to further the conversation. You might have valid points, but if you come into it saying, well, you're dumb or fuck you, what follows after that, and you see it all the time with threads where people don't know each other. It's just people being mean to each other. And probably that wouldn't happen in person, but so many people lack actual conversation skills in this day and age. So I've kind of like taken upon myself with my personal platform to be sharing and posting a lot of these variable things that I enjoy talking about and learning about. It's not just squatting and fitness posts all the time. It's like dog training, farming, agriculture, food, anything, you name it, like books I'm reading, and trying to get more and more people to comment on my posts. Even if I have to put something that I'm like typing it up, I'm like, well, that's gonna piss someone off, and I hope it sparks a conversation, because I don't want to be replying, oh hey, you're a dumbass, or well, I don't agree with your point of view, so it's wrong. I want to tell that person, yes, I understand where you're coming from. This is where I disagree with you for these reasons, because then I hope it kind of ripples that same thing in their social media thread, because so much of social media is it's when you look at the way it's revamping itself whenever it does like an update, it's obviously advertisement based. Like that's how they make their money. So you have to be aware of that. But it also makes it so things you don't like don't show up in your feed as often. And I think that's something people have to be very aware of.
Yeah.
Because I'm very much of like challenging myself to grow. So I want to be exposed. It's like that's why I send friend requests on Facebook. The only reason I keep Facebook, because it can be very negative, is so that I'm exposed to ideas and topics that I might not see throughout the day normally, or I might not go seek. Does that make sense? So even people I might not agree with what they're trying to talk about, or their feelings on a certain topic, I'll still like their post just so it keeps showing. Because if you don't do that, you'll just have a smaller and smaller feed that's like an echo chamber of your ideas.
Exactly.
And
yeah.
So that's like things I don't think a lot of people think about when it comes to technology and social media. And maybe you just don't have the bandwidth, or you just don't give a fuck. Maybe you just want to be in your insulated little world where people are just repeating.
Yeah.
It's like it's similar when I go to hunting, trapping, or BHA, backcountry hunters and anglers events. Everyone's talking about all these awesome ways to get maybe more people outdoors or into hunting or rah public lands. It's like, yeah, but we all came here for that. Of course we're all going to feel that way.
Yeah.
For me, it's like going at the gym or out with people who maybe have never been outdoors or have never been hunting or trapping, and then they make a comment about maybe like a very erroneous type comment where they're like, when it comes to trapping, somebody posted, I see a ton of dogs or ton of animals injured by these kind of traps. I'm like, well, those are all illegal traps. And what is a ton of dogs? Like even one obviously sucks, but people are so easy to dramatize everything. And I kind of want to just like get down to like actual numbers or actual conversation. So with this long rant, I guess I'll bring it back, is just having the animals on the system and not exaggerating because I think animals are getting vilified right now. We see Netflix, all the Netflix documentaries where there's big name celebrities, a lot of money getting thrown at juicing everything, the idea of a superfood, all of these plant-based products where it's like, they're cutting down the rainforest to make all these soybeans, or the transportation involved with getting these items from somewhere in the world to central Wisconsin, or when people post, oh, I'm eating vegan and I'm not hurting anything, and it's like their prepackaged bag of spinach in winter, and then their beans from God knows where. I'm like, do you understand how all of that got to be where you are? Like, whereas I'm eating frozen venison that was in the freezer that I killed myself, and then pickled beets or frozen this in the freezer, and they're trying to say it's more ethical or it's more sustainable. So I brought that rant full circle. I apologize. It's the coffee. It's getting me all fired up.
No, I you said a lot of things there, and I understand and think that you're right. I'm a little bit more of a novice in social media, so I don't see all of those things. I participate in social media, but primarily from a advertising angle, trying to just get the word out about our farm and about our coffee roasting business. And I feel a little bit sad sometimes because I feel like it's one-sided, that I'm just like putting stuff out, but I'm not a good friend. Like, I don't read other people's posts and think deeply about them because I just don't have the bandwidth to do that.
Definitely.
But I do feel like, at least in the last couple of years, having increased, the amount of social media stuff we're doing, we're letting people know that we exist, and that's a good thing. And I mean, definitely there's a lot of negative things about animal agriculture. We have serious issues here in Wisconsin with groundwater contamination from large-scale farms and manure. But that's why I said, animals have their place when done ethically on a small scale. And to me, scale is probably the most important variable. And that's one of the reasons why I love working with these farmers in Mexico and in Kenya, doing the permaculture course that we do in the summer, doing the coffee harvesting trip we do in the winter to Mexico, because, these are farmers who are working on, fractions of acres, really small scale, intensive, organic agroforestry systems. And there's so much that we can learn from that. On so many different levels. There's a lot that we learn that inspires us to try here on our farm, whether it's, organic fertilizer, compost preparations, or different ways of planting, intercropping, or indigenous vegetables that we're eating that, other people see as weeds and don't want to have anything to do with. But it's also inspiring to see their, social, cultural, and their dietary, aspects of how they're living so connected to the land and how that's so important to them. There's just a lot that we can gain from looking outside, getting outside of our bubble, like you're talking about. And, when I think about coffee, for instance, this is delicious coffee, by the way. Thank you very much.
Shout out, Ruby.
I think it's really important as a coffee roaster myself to try everybody else's coffee. Because if I'm just always going to be sampling my own coffee the way I like roasting coffee, I'm going to get to a point where my taste buds, my sensory abilities are very limited. I've got the blinders on, and I'm going to limit my ability to experience other things. And whereas if I sample a wide range of coffees all the time and keep testing myself to see, do I like this a little bit more? Do I like this a little bit more? We got to be open to change. We got to be flexible to new ideas. And I especially like seeing what's happening here, Stevens Point, Portage County, the young blood that's coming up and the creativity and things that are happening here compared to, 15 years ago when I first came here. I was in that position and I thought, wow, this is kind of an old community. It's not, I don't know if I'm going to stay here.
Yeah.
And now, having, been here for a while, I really appreciate what's happening, the creativity, and the younger folks who are seeing Stevens Point and saying, this is the place to be. This is where I want to start my business. This is where I want to have a family, buy a house, start farming, start these creative. I see it as we need to keep diversifying what we call community, what we call local. It's a matter of time. Like, to put it in perspective, when I moved here in 2006, there were 3 CSA farms. And now, how many are there? There's not only, over a dozen CSA farms, there's so many different kinds of CSAs now. You've got the traditional vegetable CSA, but you've got cider CSAs, you've got coffee CSAs, egg, meat CSAs.
Bread.
baked
Baked goods.
bakery. It's just awesome, and that's the direction we're going. Not just with food, but you need that sort of. You need the infrastructure there. You know, you need to have. I'm not calling myself an elder by any means, but you need to have elders in the community who facilitate that, you know, and give it, you know, the okay for new people to come in and find their niche and diversify and fill those niches that exist there to keep making it more diverse and more complete.
Yeah, it's like bacteria and microbes. You need more of them.
Yeah, exactly. You got to feed the microbes.
I like it. So let's. I always think of you as an elder when I come talk at the farmers market. Your straw hat. You've just got like a Yoda type presence to yourself. You know, like you're full of knowledge and information, and you're always willing to share it. Let's go all the way back to young John. Where are you from? How did you grow up? There's the last podcast I did with the Garden Guru, talking about like the effect that growing up, my grandma had a half-acre garden, and she ran basically, like, her growing up, they had a local convenience / bait shop / sold all kind of manner of homestead type products. Where does your early inspiration or ideas come from?
Well, I grew up in Wisconsin. Broadly, I lived in Fitchburg, which is just south of Madison, but I spent a lot of time in the woods and a lot of time fishing and hunting and doing foraging. Mm-hmm. That was what my family was big into when I was growing up. We didn't have a garden. My grandparents had a garden, but it wasn't a major part of my upbringing. But fishing and hunting, processing animals and food, mushrooms, spending just a lot of time on the water, a lot of time in the woods. That was my upbringing.
Will you combine? So, I want you to dive deeper into the foraging and hunting part of it. Like this spring, I've always kind of appreciated people that I know that forage, and this is the first year in the spring where I kind of like dove into it more. I've got this thick book. I forget the name of the author, but he's from Wisconsin. So it's primarily about foraging in Wisconsin.
Sam Thayer's book?
That sounds, what is it? It's the beginner's guide to foraging or something.
Okay. Well, Sam Thayer's a really big one.
That's probably the one. But this spring, like the amount of foraging I was doing, I'm like, I don't need to go to the grocery store. Yeah. Like I was getting primarily all of my greens and everything just from, I'm already walking around the woods with my dog or running trails or whatever. I'm just brought a little bag with and foraged. So that blew my mind this year. So I'm sure with a family that did it, like why would I have a garden? I just go like, I've got to water it. I've got to weed it, blah, 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 blah. If I just go out and forage, I'm out there anyways. You're saying hunting and fishing. So.
Yeah, I mean, we did tons of things. I mean, my dad was, you know, he still hunts, fishes like crazy. Like that's primary. He just really wanted to get me and my sister out in the woods, you know, doing everything, you know. So I remember when I was, you know, probably like 5 years old, like going out ice fishing on Lake Mendota and almost like falling. Like I was small enough that my whole body could just about fit through a hole in the ice. And like I remember falling in up to my waist and then having, you know, getting soaking wet and having to be like rushed off the ice and warmed up and stuff. But I try to bring that to my kids now, is like, don't be afraid to push them and get them out in the woods, make them uncomfortable, because they're really going to appreciate it later in life. But yeah, I mean, like turkey hunting in the spring, fishing all summer, waterfowl hunting in the fall, deer hunting, ice fishing in the winter, you know, spring morel hunting, you know, puffballs and just all that stuff, you know, wild greens. So that's what I loved. And my mom was a home ec teacher. So she was always experimenting with different things in the kitchen. My dad loved cooking too. So a big part of the inspiration for me on wanting to farm, wanting to do local food comes from the kitchen as well.
Mm-hmm.
And that's why I'm really excited about having Adelante, our new cafe, coffee roastery, farm market in Almond, because it's keeping me from being totally in, when you have a farm, you can easily spend all your time on the farm and never do anything else and still feel like you're always like a month behind. But now having this other space to manage and be in, like we started Taco Tuesdays and we're doing Sunday cookouts there, it's forcing me to spend time in the kitchen, which is also something I love. So that's great. And it, allows me to share what we're doing on a different level by sharing prepared food and recipes and hearing, getting feedback and suggestions from people in Almond who come to the restaurant.
Mm-hmm.
That's really fun. So I grew up doing a lot of this wildlife stuff. Actually had a pretty negative feeling towards agriculture because growing up in Wisconsin, I saw agriculture as monoculture, row crops, corn and soybeans, dairy farms, and being a forager and a hunter and an angler, I saw those as kind of opposing things.
Mm-hmm.
Like more land, more forest is being converted into farmland. Now it's even more of a problem that farmland that I grew up hunting and fishing around is now being turned into housing and paved and highways and things.
Same back home. Some of the spots growing up, my dad, we grew up raising beagles for rabbits. So like we'd have anywhere from 4 to 8 beagles at our house plus house dogs. So for me, I'm very much like the crazy dog person. And that's like where Django comes from. Growing up, I kind of always wanted a bird dog. We always had hounds. My cousin raised hounds for bear and raccoon. So I finished college and I'm like, once again deciding we were going to stay in Point, just like bird dog. I'm all in. Like read all the books, got a dog. I'm just like the hours invested in him. But yeah, I go back home and I pull out Onyx Maps and then like where we used to, I'm like in that place is where to take Django. I'm like, we always had grouse here. And I look it up now and where we used to run the beagles for like prime rabbit habitat, like had just been cut, was probably heavily harvested every 20, 30 or 40 years, but plenty of rabbit habitat. It's all houses, condos, duplexes. I'm like, no.
Yeah.
It's a bummer.
So people have just become progressively less exposed to those wild places that were in the fringes of the farmlands. As the farmland decreases, so do those fringes decrease and those areas where you could get wild food.
So this got me thinking back to those farmers in Kenya. They've got the small farms. Is it because there's like how much wild space is around them? What does that look like with in relation to wild places and wild animals?
Well, let me answer that by kind of continuing this progression in my experience. And so I was, like I was saying, I was a student in college studying wildlife and forestry, was very into, habitat management and public lands and, possibly like government work, that kind of interested me at the time. And I worked at a summer camp in northern Wisconsin on Trout Lake.
Okay.
And it was interesting. I mean, Trout Lake is this beautiful, deep, clear, cold lake in Vilas County near Boulder Junction. And I grew up fishing for walleyes there with my family. And I found out while I was in college that there was this boys camp there that did like tripping, canoe trips, hiking trips. And it was right on Trout Lake on the Trout River. It's called Red Arrow Camp.
Okay.
And so I ended up working there for 4 summers while I was in college. And loved it. Loved working with the kids, which was surprised me. Mostly doing, the older age kids, taking long canoe paddle trips. But what I learned, we had campers there. There were about 100 campers there, and counselors from different parts of the world. And so I got to be really good friends with some of the counselors from Mexico in particular. And so after my second year there, I decided to study abroad because I was just really enjoyed my friendships with those guys. And so I went to study abroad in South Africa. And this was right around the time when Nelson Mandela was retiring. And I was blown away. I went to South Africa because I wanted to study large mammals, because that was my thing I was into. And when I got there, I knew very little about apartheid, didn't know very much about poverty, wasn't interested in farming. And I took a bunch of ecology classes where we did a lot of field work. It was a different style of education there. It was kind of the European style where you went to your lectures all throughout the semester, but you didn't have any homework or anything. And then you just did like a big research project or a big exam at the end of the semester. So I had a lot of time throughout the semester, both doing labs and also just doing just trips to visit all of these protected areas, huge parks like Kruger National Park, Drakensberg National Park, other places. And they were just gorgeous and had tons of animals. But what I realized while I was there for 6 months was there were tons of communities of poor people living outside of these protected areas that weren't benefiting in any way. And the people who were enjoying these wildlife were white people from South Africa, Europeans, Americans, foreigners who were benefiting financially and, however, spiritually from the idea of these parks being there. But there were people living right outside the gates to these parks who didn't have enough to eat, who didn't have access to land and clean water and waste management. And that experience made me realize that there had to be some other direction for me. So rather than trying to manage these beautiful landscapes for wildlife, I wanted to do something that could integrate people and conservation. So that shifted I finished school and decided to join the Peace Corps then. And so then I went to Togo, which is this little sliver of a country between Liberia and Burkina Faso and Ghana in West Africa. And I worked with coffee and cocoa farmers, and that's how I started roasting coffee. But the real thing that impressed me of living with these farmers in Togo was it was a totally different type of wilderness. It was a wilderness that was inhabited by people. So it wasn't some place that people were separate or visitors from. It was a place that people managed, that people lived in, grew all their food, harvested the crops and the things that they needed to build their houses, energy for cooking, for other, needs. They were integrated totally with the landscape, but they were living off the grid, no electricity, no running water. And they were totally happy. They had these beautiful markets twice a week where they, traded goods, brought all their food. They weren't disconnected from the outside world, but these were very wild, very natural places, especially the shade-grown coffee farms that I spent a lot of time in. And there was a lot of wildlife, people hunting, trapping, fishing. I had a couple of fish ponds as part of one of the projects that I did, and we were growing tilapia in the fish ponds. But there were wild catfish that were called snakeheads, and these soft-shell crabs that lived in the river that was next to where our ponds were, and they colonized our fish ponds, And, being who I was, I then, worked with these friends of mine to make these bamboo traps so we could trap these soft shell crabs.
That's awesome.
And I was like, we're going to sell the tilapia because we don't want these soft shell crabs are so much better to eat than the tilapia are. But that was, it just shifted my whole worldview about what nature is and what the role of people in nature can be. And up until then, it had always been this idea of managing wild landscapes for habitat for wildlife, that we're only coming in occasionally to disturb things and to manage it, to harvest things. Mm-hmm. But this was a totally different thing where people were integrated completely, lived in the wilderness. So it's that's how I see things now, as the more appropriate role of people in the landscape in an ecological sense. Mm-hmm. is seeing yourself as a vessel for microbes, as a part of the landscape. You're integrated into that landscape. It's not something that exists out there that has to be preserved apart from you. Mm-hmm. You can play a positive role. When we started out our permaculture class just last month, I drew this symbol on the board that was kind of a spontaneous thing because it was an icebreaker activity. I was trying to get people to think in symbols and in patterns. And I drew up on the board this yin-yang symbol, and on one half of it had a footprint representing like the impact, the potential negative impact that all people are going to have. We're all going to have an impact. We're all going to modify the environment that we live in. And then the other half of the yin-yang was the handprint, showing, like, representing the nurturing side that we can have. And to me, that's where we are. That's what liberation farming means, is to find your place in the ecosystem, to understand your role, and to create this balance between the impact that you have and the growing, the nurturing that you do, and to find a balance there that can, coexist.
I'm so fired up right now. I love that, man. How do you not see yourself as the wise elder after just that, sharing that story, man?
Because the more you think you know, the more you realize you don't know.
It's so true. Everything I do, from coaching people, movement, in what I do daily, what I spend so much time thinking about, and all the hours helping people with every week, at the end of the week, I'm like, shit, I don't know enough, and there's so much I don't know. It's an awesome feeling. I love it. And then it comes to all these systems I know and things I'm just passionate about, hunting, recreating, just the psychology of all of it. So what you're talking about, man, I love. It wasn't Liberation Farms when you were in town, correct? That was just your small scale, but you're still doing a lot farm. So where was that transition? So you're in South Africa, and then you come back. Is that when you get into farming?
Yeah, well then, I went to Peace Corps, spent 2 years in the Peace Corps, then finished graduate school, lived in Montana for a couple of years. That's where I went to grad school in University of Montana. And then got hired to move here to Stevens Point to work at UWSP. There was this little unit that used to be part of the CNR that was called GEM, which mm-hmm. was the Global Environmental Management Education Center. It doesn't exist anymore, but that's where for 5 years I was working as a agroforestry extension person. And that's where I established the relationships that I now continue. Now that I don't work at the university anymore, I work as a private consultant doing agroforestry in Kenya. But that's during that time, I worked with small community-based farmer organizations, primarily women's groups in both Kenya and Mexico, working on all sorts of different organic farming, agroforestry, rotational grazing, tree planting projects. And those became the people that we now partner with for our coffee supply, for Liberation Coffee, and for the sites that we visit when we go to Kenya and do our permaculture class. So that 5-year period when I was working at UWSP was like set the stage for starting Liberation Farmers. And that was also the time when that met Holly. We both felt like that's what we wanted to do. We both had this background and experience in ecology and international travel, farmers working internationally, but also had a really strong desire to grow our own food and become rooted in the community here. For me, like working for 5 years where I was constantly traveling around, working with these awesome farmer projects, it was amazing, but it was also dissatisfying because I didn't have the time to really do it here. And to me, that felt like ingenuine at a certain point, that I was working with farmers, supposedly training them to do things that I didn't do as a livelihood.
Yeah.
And now I feel much stronger connections with the farmers because I'm farming for a living, and I understand that the challenges the obstacles that you face are really a lot harder than I thought they were when I was just an advisor, you know. I didn't see the full picture so much. But so now it's a real mix of different things, but I would say that we're in a pretty good place. We still both work off the farm. Holly works full time as a forest entomologist at the university. In her free time, she roasts coffee and delivers all of our farm products when she comes to town. I spend a lot of time on the farm now at Adelante at the cafe, doing the food things and coffee roasting. But I also, we both really value these connections that we have with farmers that we work with internationally. It keeps us sane, you know, being able to have that time off the farm. Like when we go teach the permaculture course in Kenya, that's like our big vacation for the year, is being away for 3 weeks. And people kind of think that's crazy because we're like working hard and teaching and camping and, you know, doing all these like hands-on farmer projects, but it's really refreshing for us to be off the farm. It gives us a great perspective to like look at what we're doing at home when we're that far away. And then we get back to the farm and we're really energized and ready to get back into it and make changes as well. You know, when you're in a rut all the time, you don't see the changes that you have to make.
For sure.
Yeah.
Dude, I love it. So much I want to cover. We're already over an hour. With kind of this Liberation Farms, this idea of the handprint and the footprint. I guess with like we'll bring it back to the workshop next week. For you, seasonal eating, the idea of what we're doing at the workshop. What are some things that your customers, the people you've talked to at maybe the farmers market, what are the big hang-ups when it comes to food prep, seasonal eating, cooking, that kind of thing? And now that you're a business owner and a parent, so maybe you can kind of relate with some of those things, because I know the things I hear in the gym. I'm just curious why you're excited for seasonal AF and what you want to help kind of answer with it.
I think one of the biggest things is people's lack of knowledge and basic skills on food preparation. I think that we've lost a lot of those techniques, those food preparation techniques. We've gotten really used to the convenience of things coming like prepackaged and ready to eat or ready to cook. And we've lost a lot of those sort of traditional habits of eating seasonally and how to utilize like a whole animal, the ability to do that. And for me, that has always like come naturally from the idea of, harvesting a deer. You're going to process that whole thing. You're going to try to use all of it. And as a funny side note, I had two roommates, one from China and one from Kenya when I first moved to Stevens Point. And I took them deer hunting over Thanksgiving, and we got some deer and we butchered them. And my Kenyan roommate was like, I can't believe how much of that animal you didn't use. And he was talking about like all the bones that were like left over when we stripped the meat off the bones, and like the skull and stuff. He was like, that's all really good meat. I can't believe you fed that to the coyotes. And I'm like, well, they got to eat too, but yeah, I mean, there's still, you can go a lot farther. It's a journey, there aren't people who are sustainable and people who aren't. It's like we're all on that trajectory. We all can be on that trajectory and can take steps in that direction wherever we may be. And so I think it has to start with some kind of inspiration, whether it's the freshness, like the healthiness of the food that people are interested in. A lot of our customers are young families. So I think there's a turning point in people's lives when they either experience the loss of somebody due to illness, or they themselves have a serious life-threatening illness, or they bring some children into the world. They start to suddenly rethink their whole, like, what is it that I'm consuming? What's the long-term effect of this going to be on my health, my children's health? And that can change their eating habits, their consumption patterns quite a bit, to where they're, okay, now I'm ready to put forth the effort to seek out a local organic farm, find out what they have seasonally, pay more for it, understanding that they're smaller scale, they're doing things differently, and there are benefits to me and benefits to the bigger ecosystem for doing that. Sometimes it's that has to happen first, that big step in your life. But I think then, like, figuring it out, like a lot of people, it's their grandparents' generation that had that knowledge about how to process animals, how to put away, do all the canning and preserving techniques, what mushrooms were edible, things like that. That's becoming, a couple generations away that we need to bring back. Those are some of the things. What about you? What are your...
For me, so I've always loved food. I've loved eating. You can tell, just I'm a heavier person, but in the health and fitness space, I can start there. It's people, the conversations and the questions people are asking about are their perceived barriers. I'm like, you don't know how to cut up a vegetable? Like, really? You don't know how to cook something? If I gave you a bone-in roast, you wouldn't know what to do with it? Like, that just, it blew my mind. But for me, I've always been surrounded by that. I've been cooking for myself since I was like 10, because I love my mom and my dad, but they're terrible cooks. Like, in the kitchen, they both suck. And I tell them that like, if I'm home, I don't let them cook. I'm like, get out of here. Like, they're both terrible. So I've taken it upon myself to cook. And I've always done that. So it's just me assuming that more people have done that. But I realize, like you've said, it's a skill. Most people, it just kind of disappears. The convenience, or the perceived convenience and ease of access we have to ready-made food products, it's definitely a problem. And that problem then becomes people are overweight. They're unaware of what's in their food when it comes from a calorie, or just fortified, in quotations, when their food has all these added things into it. So in the health and fitness space, when people are talking about macros, calories in versus calories out, timing of foods, carbs, heavy carb day, low carb day, all of this food science that's emerging, I think a large part of it would be mitigated and fixed if people just ate seasonally. It's something we've only recently had to approach this topic of how much food do I need to eat? Like all of these things that are current, I think would be solved if you just ate seasonally. And then we can start to have the conversation about performance, calories in versus we can get nerdy on the science of food once you're actually understanding food, where it comes from, the seasonality of it, like the fact that you can eat like spinach year round because it's in these bags where we don't know where it comes from, I think is a problem. Or the fact that you can just get all these foods and not understand where they're coming from, how they grow, where they're being grown, the effect on your environment, I think is a bigger picture problem. But at the end of the day, people just don't understand where food comes from, and they don't know what they're eating. And so that was a big part of it for me. And the other fact is we this winter, I brought up the farmers market a few times, and people had no idea. These were people that have, many of them, born and raised in Stevens Point or have been here much longer than I have, and they had no idea the winter farmers market is right down the road from the gym. So on the weekends, it would be like, get a workout in, and I would tell people to go there. Get breakfast from Primitive Pastures, hit up your local farmers, talk to them about spring and summer CSAs, and we eventually we have a dozen people, I think, at the gym with a CSA from Lonely Oak. Yeah. So we get vegetables dropped off at the gym, and a full share is $30 a week. It's less than $30 a week. If you eat the vegetables in that box every week, you will not have an issue with weight, performance, fuel. Like, you just eat that box.
Yeah.
Like, that's it. You don't have to be weird about counting anything or keeping track of what you're eating. Just eat that. Obviously, you're going to need to add in some form of protein. So depending on your ethical constraints, your environmental constraints, cultural constraints, I'm not going to tell you what to eat, because I'm just eat what's in that box. It's seasonal. It's grown here. I'm like that. It's that simple. Do that consistently. We do that consistently. Then we can start talking about macronutrients, timing, calories in versus calories out. Maybe you want to start, there's nothing wrong with desserts or anything like that. Sugar, whatever, all these things people vilify, but it needs to start with like seasonal food. Then we can start adding all the other shit. And it's literally that simple, but no one got that. So I was like, well, let's just make it a thing. Let's make it a workshop series. Luckily, Lane at Farm Shed and the 1,000 Lumens dudes were like, fuck yeah, let's do it. Let's make it a thing. And that it's going to be a video series we're going to be able to release where it's out there and like, just do this. This is what people need. And along the way, the cooking techniques like you were talking about, I just assumed everyone knew those things. They don't. Having those out there, super simple, meal prep ideas. So really it just, and then even just talking with Sheffy, like he's getting out to the schools, showing kids vegetables for the first time. I do that, the gym garden, like taking, like once I'm able to pick stuff, bring vegetables in, and I'm big on like the power of competition, fun competition where everyone's involved, there's choice, it's a fun time, and being able to award someone with like these vegetables, they're grown right out there, like doing that. So that's kind of all where it came from for me, is just getting people to realize like it's not an end-all be-all answer to everything, but I think if people started with just that box of produce every week and eat that and understand it and get to know your farmer. Everybody loves Joel. Like they love him at the gym. They love talking to him. Everybody's excited to go to the farmer's market and be like, that's the guy I get my food from. They share with their family, and it just kind of brings together this, like you were talking about, this idea of community. Tapped Maple Syrup was at a fitness competition. They were one of the sponsors, and talking with Jeremy, and we're sitting there, and there's all these like super jacked women and dudes walking around. He's like, this is a very different market that I usually go to, because he's at the local food farm shed, environments typically. And there's all these people walking around and they're sampling his new carb replacement where it's just maple sap.
Yeah.
Like, how fucking cool is that? Wisconsin maple trees and making a electrolyte / carb replacement drink for that. And that's what I'm super passionate about, is how do I bridge these worlds that I'm super interested in and I see where they're connected? How do I bridge that? And that's kind of where the tour came about, and reaching out to all the amazing farmers we have in the area.
I love it. I really commend you for that, for the work you're doing. I mean, just awareness building, that's super important.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think it's good to think outside the box too.
Definitely.
It's funny because you're saying, like, just eat this box. Like, let's make it super simple. But we have to, I don't know. We also need to challenge people to think about their, I don't know, like what is our culture? You know, like where are we? Like, let's regroup. Let's reevaluate. Like, what is it that box represents? What kind of a beautiful farm in a larger beautiful landscape in a beautiful community? How can, that box be? It's not just a box, It's like, we want to make it simple, but we don't want to dumb it down. We also want you to see the beauty that box represents and how different that box is from the grocery store box. Like that grocery store, there was a lady who was one of the early folks in Farm Shed who doesn't live in Stevens Point anymore, but her name was Kate. And I always remember she came on the Tuning Fork, one of the early episodes of the Tuning Fork, and I asked her a question about local food, what it meant to her. And this was, back in 2007. And she said, well, when you eat out of the box, and you become the box. You are the box. And I was like, wow, that's really profound. Like, what does that mean? But I still think about that when I think about, like, the box or the man or the system or whatever. I think of this funny time when Kate said that, like, whether you're talking about, like, prepackaged, pre-made meals where you just add water, or like Hamburger Helper or whatever, or just like the idea of the big box store, or, all of those things to me are like the box. And so we have this joke at Liberation Farm about, you are the box.
You are the box.
So yeah, let's think outside the box. Let's think about what that box is. Like, all those vegetables. Look at the diversity that's in there. Look at how colorful they are. Look at how much it challenges you as the person eating those things. Like, how am I going to use 20 different vegetables this week? Small quantities of each one. I do think that's a bit of a barrier. So that's why I really love your idea of this show, of making it fast and convenient, showing people how to use the crock pot, the Instapot, cook these things in a healthy way, but that doesn't take, you don't have to research it and plan for weeks in advance to make this meal. It's a simple thing. I mean, that's how it works on the farm too. Like, most of the time we're putting in such long days that we might not even think about what we're having for dinner until 9 o'clock at night. And we're like, oh yeah, what are we going to eat here? So it's got to be fast. It's got to be delicious too, though.
For sure. I love it. And that's even, like you were talking about with your travels, so many of these things I enjoy watching, be it even like Anthony Bourdain's Parts Unknown, or Meat Eater with Stephen Ranella. When they're traveling to these far-off places, the meals are communal. It's from the land, and a lot of the times it's just like a big pot, like you were talking about, like soups, stews, it's just these like meals where it's just all in there, and it cooks and it simmers, and then all of it kind of just mixes together and makes this amazing end product. And I'm super fascinated with that kind of cooking. Like, I love it. Like, if you look at most of my meals, it's just like everything's together, blended. And for me, if I were to go back years ago, like, that's how I've always kind of cooked and eaten, and I enjoy it, and I love sharing those meals with people and be able to, like, this is what I threw in there. People are like, what the hell? And then when we eat it, They're like, this is amazing. Like the meatballs at the first workshop, radishes, mint, radish greens, turnips, like all of these things are in the meatballs.
Ooh, nice.
And people are like, what? I'm like, yeah, just bear with me. And then we have them. People are like, these meatballs are amazing. There's like rhubarb cut up in one of them.
Wow.
Like I loved this rhubarb, especially just cooking it and not just being in dessert. Don't get me wrong, rhubarb desserts, I'm all in. I'll fight people for rhubarb desserts, but just being able to cook with it in ways that people aren't expecting. That's the big part of it too, is like getting creative, thinking outside the box. I'm stealing that from now on. I'm stealing that, but using these vegetables in ways that typically you're not going to you won't see anywhere.
I think we need to also like establish new patterns. People, like, that's a big part of figuring out your place in the landscape, in the ecosystem. If you spend time with like the coffee farmers that we visit on our coffee harvest trips in January, you realize they spend an incredible amount of time every day in the kitchen.
Mm-hmm.
That's something that we have learned for some reason here in our culture, that's not desirable or not necessary.
Mm-hmm.
And we're paying the price for it.
Definitely.
And it's just amazing. That's how I describe the coffee harvest trip. Is it's part working vacation where you're learning about agroforestry systems and all the steps from bringing coffee from soil management to plant to harvesting to processing to drying to before it's even roasted. But equally part of that trip is all that time that we spend in the kitchen,
mm-hmm.
making masa, making tamales, tortillas, salsa, cooking on the comal with the wood fire. I mean, we spend at least as much time there in Elvira's little kitchen as we do in the coffee farm picking coffee.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that's great, but that's one of those things where we need to regroup
mm-hmm.
as a culture here and say, like, why don't we do that?
Yeah.
Why don't we all make our own bread or our own tortillas? Why don't we all take the time to grow the herbs to put in our food that just if you use fresh herbs alone would make your food
so good.
Twice as delicious as it currently is. It's the little things like that we can do that aren't, you don't have to be a major hippie tree hugger
mm-hmm.
to do those little things. It's like, let's just look at how we spend our time every day.
Yep.
And where can we make adjustments?
Definitely. Love it, man. Let's that was a good, that itself was a good concluder. So I don't know if you have I always like to just like sum up the whole episode with the guest and ask them like what, I guess if you had to sum up the whole episode, but I think you just did that. But if you want to do it again, or you've got another kind of thought line, hit us with that.
I think it's good to leave it at that. Just invite people to like come be a part of this cooking experience.
Mm-hmm.
The seasonal AF cooking. Come in, be a part of it. Meet the farmers. Get to know what's inside that box, what it represents.
Mm-hmm. Inside and outside. John, where can people find you? All the places.
Liberation Farmers on Facebook and Instagram. Our website, liberationfarmers.com. Call me.
Join the
Email.
Liberation.
Yeah.
Farmers Market, Stevens Point Farmers Market, Saturdays.
Yep. We've got new hours at Adelante now, which is our farm market kitchen in Almond. It's a great place to be. I love being in Almond. It's off the beaten path.
Mm-hmm.
There's no easy way to get there, which is a good thing.
Yep.
But we've got extended hours now. We're open for breakfast on Tuesday mornings. And then we have Tuesday night taco night, which was a big hit. And this week we're going to be doing more tacos and clayudas. Clayudas are grilled tostadas with beans and meat and cheese and veggies on top of them, served open face, and they're crunchy with salsa drizzled on top.
So it's like a Crunchwrap Supreme without the wrap.
I don't know what that is.
Oh, I will make you some Crunchwrap. We'll make. So Taco Bell came out with these Crunchwrap Supremes, and they're just dog shit, like not good. So it's a tostado, and you grill that, and so my favorite way to do it is I make a mix with ground venison, and when I do ground meat with venison, it's the deer, and then I get either applewood or the peppered bacon from Newski's, the ends when they do their big bulk sale. I grind that together. It's like 80-20, sometimes 70-30. But that, black beans, all the veggies. So that's big skillet of that. Tostada, meat, more veggies, like raw veggies, salsa, maybe some avocado slices, and then you wrap that in a giant flour tortilla, and then you panini press it.
Oh, wow.
And then if you want to, you get crazy. Greek yogurt with some kind of hot sauce, you mix that together, and you dip that.
This is a fusion thing, I bet. This is definitely a fusion thing. I don't know where that would be authentic to. I don't know. Those different things.
One day I was just like, I think I was working out. I'm like, that's it.
Yeah.
That's what I'm doing.
Yeah. So, gosh, that sounds amazing. So that's our idea, is that we're trying to, at Adelante, is establish these hours with these themes, but that we're going to change it up. So maybe you'll see that Crunch Wrap making an appearance.
I think I've talked with Joel about it, but I'll be a guest cook. I'm not a chef. I know chefs, and I'm not a chef. I will be a guest kitchen staff at the Lonely Oak Brunch, and I would love to do the same thing at Adelante.
Yeah, that's the idea. We're not chefs either by any means at all, but we would like Adelante to be a destination for farm-to-table food. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to get it started by doing breakfast and taco night. Once we get our pizza oven going, we want to do pizza nights. Mm. Sundays, we are open on Sundays. We do brunch in the morning, 9 until noon, and then noon to 4, we do cookout. But it's a cookout theme, so that means every week it's going to be something different. This Sunday, we're doing smoked pork ribs and cornbread and strawberry shortcake because it's strawberry season.
That sounds fantastic.
Yeah. But it's going to be different. So we're hoping, though, eventually we'll get enough farms so that we'll be able to do 1 or 2 nights a week, and we'll have 3 or 4 other farms and guests who come in there and do the same thing and feature stuff from their farm as well. So it'll be this destination place that people can go for that.
I like it.
Yeah.
That's awesome. Well, John, thanks for coming on. Thanks for taking the time out of your crazy summer farm schedule to kind of share your mission and your story, because I'm fired up right now.
It's been great.
Cool.
Thank you.
Thank you.